Out of all the modern discoveries science has made about nature in the past 100 years or so, few are as shocking or as bleak as the outcome of the Gombe Chimpanzee War. Observations made about chimps leading up to this conflict had already challenged many preconceived notions about animal behavior to that point, marking a shift in what were considered uniquely human traits. Prior to this, it was thought that no other animals used tools or had the intellectual capacity for intricate emotions. It wasn't until Dr. Jane Goodall and her research team got a first-hand glimpse into the world of great apes that science came to understand that not only do chimps have complex social behaviors, but that these can be quite brutal and unnecessarily nasty. The impact of what Dr. Goodall witnessed was so profound that it forever changed how she herself viewed chimpanzees, leaving her with vivid nightmares for decades thereafter. So what sparked the Gombe Chimpanzee War? What was its outcome? And what have we learned about our species' ancestry from it? Though now known across the world as the foremost expert on primates, Jane Goodall had no scientific background when she first left for Africa in 1957. Working as a secretary, she took it upon herself to get in touch with paleoanthropologist Louis Leakey shortly after arriving. Louis was impressed by Jane from the get-go, sensing that her lack of formal schooling could be an asset that challenged the rudimentary and often stodgy methods of academia. Within 3 years, he sent Jane on the first of many trips to the Gombe Stream National Park to observe chimpanzees and other primates. Eventually, her studies led to getting a bachelor's degree in natural sciences and a PhD thereafter. Right out of the gate, Dr. Goodall made a splash with her unconventional research methods that gave chimps more credit than other biologists tended to. Rather than label the apes she studied with numbers, for example, Dr. Goodall opted to give them individual names like David Greybeard, something other researchers believed anthropomorphized the animals too much. The commonly held belief about chimpanzees at the time was the image of them as peaceful vegetarians with intellectual capacity far below what would soon be observed. Before long, Dr. Goodall made the startling discovery that not only were chimps meat eaters, but very distinguished hunters to boot. Chimpanzees didn't just go after bush pigs as prey, but more often than not, they killed and ate other primates such as the red colobus. Up until this point, it was also believed that humans were the only animal to create and employ the use of tools. Another fact refuted when Jane saw chimpanzees fashioning tools out of twigs and sticks to attract and scoop out termites from their nests. It's now known that other animals like otters, crows, and octopuses also use tools for a wide variety of reasons. Though at times it seemed her work was stymied by the apprehension of the chimps she observed, through dedicated study, Dr. Goodall was able to publish these findings and more across a variety of mediums, including in magazines and on film. Other researchers grew jealous of Dr. Goodall's popularity with the public, and some ridiculed her notion that chimpanzees had complex emotional and social lives resembling that of human beings. Undeterred, Dr. Goodall continued to build the trust of the apes at Gombe, which she had christened the Kasakala tribe. Notions about the complexity of ape culture would only be further challenged as the true nature of these animals revealed itself after a watershed moment in the tribe. Dr. Goodall and her team had used a banana feeding station to attract chimpanzees for closer observation. This helped establish a few key ideas about chimpanzee social interaction in the early 1970s, with one research paper noting, quote, "Two males were considered buddies if they were spotted arriving together at the feeding station more often than other pairs." Though it was believed that the local chimpanzee community was united as one, over time it became clear there was either a rift forming or one already established. Territorially, one group appeared to favor the north, whereas others stuck mostly to the south. A clear animosity developing between the two groups was first observed in 1971. Since by now the groups rarely intermingled and would attempt to show off or intimidate the other upon meeting. These apes would hoot loudly, throw things, and try to chase each other out of their perceived territory. Professor Ann Pussy, who had joined Dr. Goodall in her observation the previous year, stated, quote, "We would hear these pant-hoot calls coming from the south and say to ourselves, 'The southern males are coming.' All the northern ones would go up in trees, and there would be a lot of screaming and displaying." Some believe the friction amongst the Kasakela chimps began back in 1970 following the death of its lead ape, an alpha male who until then had been able to keep the peace. The southern clan was said to have broken off in the months following this. These chimps, now dubbed the Kahama tribe, were composed of 9 adults and their children. The Kahama were headed by a pair of brothers named Charlie and Hugh, who served as co-alphas. The Kasakala, on the other hand, were headed by a chimp named Humphrey, who was kept in line by the brothers. Despite all the chest thumping on both sides, the encounters still tended to be cordial, if not tense. Researchers came to believe that the division was fueled by a power struggle between Charlie and Hugh and their rival Humphrey, who had been known to throw rocks and on his own was a formidable opponent. This would change in 1972, though, as the two groups would more often than not avoid each other. The Kahama tribe would eventually stop visiting the banana dispensary at the camp altogether. By now, Humphrey had been knocked down from alpha male status by another chimp named Figgin, who held the post through to the end of the war. Yet divisions remained highest when Humphrey and Charlie were in each other's company, with encounters usually breaking out into intimidation displays and posturing. The distinction between the two groups was formally recognized by researchers in early 1973. The old guard of both tribes, who had been familiar with each other for years, were now the only chimps between the two to get along, specifically two elder apes named Mike and Goliath. Kasakala chimpanzees would now wait to hear the calls of the Kahama off yonder before feeding in their area. The two groups often stared each other down during the infrequent times they met through 1973, hooting and banging around if the opposite side fled. Tensions would boil over just a year later. The relative peace between the two groups was suddenly and brutally ended by early January of 1974. A male chimp from the Kahama tribe, named Goodall, was silently ambushed by 8 apes from the Kasakala tribe as he was eating up in a tree. Among the Kasakalas were 7 males and a tough-as-nails childless female named Gigi. The apes, led by Humphrey, gave chase as Goodall attempted to escape, grabbing him by his legs and forcing him down. A sea of inhuman fangs descended upon Goodall and began violently digging into him in a way no one would have expected from chimps at the time. Most shocking of all was how Humphrey purposely kept a tight grasp on Goodall and sat on his head as his fellow apes landed repeated blows, so as to not let their victim escape. After about 10 minutes of thrashing, the jeering crew of Kasakalas concluded their attack as a Kasakala ape named Hugo threw a rock at him. The chimps then left Goodall face down in the mud as they loudly charged further into Kahama soil before heading home. Though Goodall did manage to get to his feet, it was clear he would soon succumb to his injuries, and indeed he was never seen again. The first casualty in the Gombe Chimpanzee War had been claimed. Not even 2 months later, another attack by Kasakala chimps took place. Yet again, the apes had boldly wandered into southern territory as if to test the waters of what they could get away with. Before long, the male apes had begun attacking a Kahama chimp named D, leading to a full-on gang assault. Unlike the last attack, though, D wasn't alone. Other Kahama apes were nearby, including alpha male Charlie and a female named Littleby who was in the midst of her heat cycle. But they would be in no position to intervene in what was to come. Kasakala apes were sure to repel them anytime they got close. Before long, all 4 Kasakala apes, including the female Gigi, joined in on the attack. Just as with Goodall, the assailants relentlessly pounded on their victim, who tried escaping through the trees until a branch broke under his weight and left him vulnerable. The chimps then continued wailing on D until they noticed the fleeing Charlie. 2 gave chase while flailing sticks around and screeching, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. Turning their attentions to Littleby, they made an attempt at displaying for her, but were rebuked. Unwilling to accept rejection, the young female was threatened by the males before being kidnapped altogether. The group marched on back to the north, pounding on tree stumps and screeching to the high heavens while D lay there badly injured. Though he managed to survive the initial attack, the war wounds caught up with him 2 months later, after which he was never seen again. The other Kahama females were hardly immune to the violence. Rather than a one-and-done burst of overwhelming carnage, though, the females were targeted multiple times over the span of several months. Littleby, by this point, had returned to the South community. Her mother, Madam B, received the worst of the first assault. Nevertheless, the females escaped relatively unscathed. Despite the kidnapping Littleby had previously escaped from, she would curiously leave with the Kasakala males once more. She did return to the Kahama tribe later on, though. This wouldn't be the last time Littleby was pressured into accompanying the Kasakala, however. Researchers found that the B family was attacked at least 3 more times, if not more. The next skirmish between the feuding clans began when a group led by Figgin's brother Fabin took up post near Kahama territory. Jane Goodall wrote that they stood sentry for almost an hour, ominously staring down their enemies from the treetops. As if something caught their attention, the group raced down to the forest floor and gave chase to the elderly Kahama chimp named Goliath. Goliath had tried to maintain friendly relations with the northern faction previously, which were usually ignored. Now his forgiveness would be repaid with brutality. The invaders taunted and beat Goliath, with this onslaught lasting about 20 minutes. Goliath attempted to play dead to no avail. It was his attackers who would decide when enough was enough. Though Goliath survived, he was severely injured, and coupled with his advanced age, would not last much longer. Yet another life had been claimed in what had to this point been an entirely one-sided conflict. What was remarkable about each encounter was how the fleeing attackers would hoot and holler as they made their escape, as if to express dominance on enemy turf. It was now 1975, and only 3 male chimps in the Kahama community remained. Charlie's brother and co-leader Hugh had vanished, almost certainly killed like the others before him. Subsequent attacks on the B family occurred between February and September of 1975. By the time of the most savage attack on Madam B, Little B had fully defected back to the Kasakala and watched her comrades deliver blow after blow on her frail mother. Madam B perished 5 days later, and both her daughters appeared to kowtow to the Kasakala community. The other 2 females of the Kahama were nowhere to be found, with researchers assuming they too had been killed or forced to join the dominating tribe. Kahama Alpha Charlie was defeated in May 1977. Though researchers didn't witness his demise firsthand, local fishermen had heard the distinct noise of a fierce battle in the distance. Days later, his body was discovered where the sounds originated, covered in the same horrendous wounds as his fallen soldiers before him. Another Kahama chimp named Willie Wally had also disappeared by this point, with his fate left ambiguous, though almost certainly grisly. By the summer, there was but one Kahama ape left, a young lad named Sniff, who had managed to evade the ever-persistent Kasakalas until he too was caught up with and summarily beaten, then left for dead. Sniff was never heard from again. His disappearance marked the conclusion of the Gombe Chimpanzee War and the complete annihilation of the Kahama tribe. The Kasakala wasted no time annexing Kahama territory, but soon found themselves butt up against a new threat, a neighboring tribe to the south called the Kalende, who had until then never reached the banana feeding stations. The Kalende began raids of their own, treating the Kasakalas as harshly as they themselves did to the Kahama. It seems Humphrey was killed in one of these skirmishes in the early 1980s, though this was never conclusively proven. The Kasakala wisely acquiesced most of their new land to avoid further conflict with the Kalende, who outnumbered them. Decades after the Gombe Chimpanzee War took place, researchers continued to pick apart the conditions that could have triggered it. Some were quick to point fingers at the research team, who they believe upset the natural balance with both their very presence and their engagement through the banana feeding stations. Yet this has been refuted in recent years, with new studies undertaken more clandestinely that found violence and conflict within chimp communities as normal rather than atypical. Research suggests that male-on-male chimpanzee violence tends to be the most common, and that it may be born out of competitiveness over resources and access to mating, which was consistent with the conditions in the Gombe chimpanzee communities. After all, access to fertile females was notably hindered in those years, which combined with the power struggle amongst male leaders created a perfect storm for domination through total brutality. The Gombe War was especially heartbreaking to Dr. Goodall. Around the same time, she witnessed a high-ranking female chimpanzee that killed and ate the young of other members in her community. Between these events, it could no longer be denied that humans were not the only animal with a predisposition for wanton violence, raising new questions about the darker side of nature. Despite this, Dr. Goodall held out hope that her findings did not preclude humanity from escaping its worst traits.
Well, yes, I do believe we have innate aggressive tendency. I don't honestly think you can look around the world today and deny that that must be true. However, that doesn't mean that war is inevitable. That doesn't mean that we have to continue in this mold of aggression. And we do have the ability to control our selfish genes.